Many young athletes struggle with discipline, consistency, and accountability. But what many young athletes don't know is that something as simple as setting goals is scientifically proven to increase your consistency and your performance. I am thrilled to be working with the company Sports Hogs. It is a family-run company that specializes in making journals where you can track your process goals. Each journal, here's mine for basketball, gives you an opportunity to list your goals, how you want to implement them, and then gives you opportunities to not only reflect on goals in your workouts, but also reflect on each game performance over the course of the season. My favorite part of these Sports Hogs journals is the space where you as an athlete can list positive affirmations to keep yourself motivated. And if you need a little extra positivity, there are great quotes from legendary athletes filled in the journal. This family did an outstanding job creating resources for young athletes all over the country. And if you want to take advantage of this resource, visit sportshogs.com. That's sportshogs.com. Get a hand on your journal today. Greetings, information superhighway. Welcome to the 16th episode of the Nail the Recruiting Process podcast. There is a ton to discuss and a great interview. So let's dive in. First, condolences to the New York Mets, but really, thank you. I don't think anybody back in April thought that this team was going to make it to Game 6 of the National League Championship Series and be ousted by, what for my historical experience with baseball is the best National League roster ever assembled in the current LA Dodgers. So, it happens, I guess, but it was such a cool ride. Incredible resilience the whole way. Even in Game 6, the NLCS, they went down swinging to a superior roster. And I think something that's really exciting is the genuine belief that Mets fans have that the core of this team is going to win a World Series. I think it was really cool also to hear Gary Cohen talk about the 1984 Mets and how energized they were with the arrival of some young stars, including Doc Gooden, and that they could tell that 86 was on the horizon because 84 happened. And that's really how we feel about this season 2024. So thank you so much for the fun memories. It was awesome. Let's go Mets. All right, but we're done grieving because now it's time to celebrate. The New York Liberty just won their first WNBA championship. They had made this dance a number of times without winning the big one, and they finally do it after being an original WNBA team. 28 years later, they get their first WNBA championship. And before I talk about the specifics of this championship, I want to say how cool it is to see some closure and some full circle moments for some legendary women's basketball players that played for the Liberty that got to be there to experience this moment. I'm thinking about people like Becky Hammon and Sue Wicks who were in attendance, but I'm also thinking about Rebecca Lobo who got to call the game on commentary. I'm bummed because there was controversial officiating in multiple games that went both ways. And I think in general, the WNBA has to do better with neutral review. But I also think that the Liberty were the better team with by far the better bench. And on the subject of that bench, the thing I want to talk to you about today, instead of answering a recruiting question, is I want to talk to any bench players out there. And by the way, even if you are a high-profile high school recruit, one of the things you're going to hear in the podcast today with my great guest who I'll be interviewing is the prospect that when you show up on college campus, you're going to be making mistakes and getting instructed in the beginning. You got to learn new things. You got to learn the game all over again. And whether you're a current bench player or you're a first year or someone getting ready to experience their first year of college and navigate that potential change where you're learning the game and you're really struggling with basketball for the first time, there was an experience in Game 5 of the finals that really, really stood out to me that I think can be a great teaching point for you. Niara Sabally gets drafted really early by the New York Liberty a few years back. She's been injured a lot. She hasn't had a full season yet where she's been healthy the whole time. And she is a true power forward who is playing behind Breanna Stewart, who's an Olympian, and Jonquel Jones, who just won WNBA Finals MVP. So there's not a tremendous amount of room for minutes for her unless the Liberty play big. She just kind of has to grow in the darkness and embrace her role as a bench player on this team. But something really interesting happens in Game 5, which is that everyone is exhausted on both teams, frankly. Napheesa Collier is really the only member of the Lynx that can get it going. I'm pretty sure that by the end of the fourth quarter, Stewie and Sabrina Ionescu were a combined 4 of 35 from the floor. Benijah Laney was struggling. Courtney Vandersloot was hurting, and they could not get production. And the Liberty looked like they're going to let this game slip away. And then all of a sudden, Niara Sabally checks into the game. This is someone who's been playing like 10 or less minutes every game of the postseason and most games of the regular season. This is also someone who I don't think has scored more than 4 points in a playoff game. And in 3 minutes of game time, from the 3-minute and 23 mark of the third quarter to the 28-second mark of the third quarter, Niara Sabally scores 9 points, doesn't miss except for one play where she misses and she gets fouled, secures 2 huge rebounds, forces a turnover, and literally swings the game for the Liberty off the bench. Now, something else really cool happens after this, which is Sandy Brondello, who's notoriously a very feel-oriented coach, goes, okay, she's giving us great energy, so we're going to ride this out. And from the point that she checks in to the end of overtime, the New York Liberty play with 3 forwards on the floor. And I'm not saying like small forward, power forward, center. I'm saying Sabrina at the 1, usually Fibic at the 2, and then power forward, center. And they adapted, they gritted it out, and they played the best defensive lineup that they could and pounded the paint and just accepted the fact that their threes were not falling and that they would have to find a different way to win. And if Niara Sabally doesn't contribute the way she does, they do not win. And it's, of course, like exclamation point driven home by her open court steal in overtime on an inbound. She's guarding the Lynx best player, the all-world Napheesa Collier, deflects the ball, pushes it ahead to herself, gets a layup, pretty much clinches the win in overtime with that sequence. This is why this is so important to me. There is nothing that Niara Sabally did in any sequence of this game that was outside of her role. Not one thing. All of her baskets were either hard sprint rolls, either to space because the defense hedged, or just hard rolls to the rim off screens, or she just ran the rim and got the ball ahead in transition, or she led the fast break herself. There was nothing fancy. There were actually extremely limited on-ball decisions being made, with one exception, a shooting foul, where she tried to drive right, they took it away, and she curled back to her left. She played within herself. And I think so often, bench players are like, when coach puts me in, I'm going to show him or I'm going to show her, and I'm going to do everything. I'm going to show them I can do everything that these starters can do. That's not what she did. She brought great energy, and she played her role, and she played her role damn well. And every time there was a small mistake by Minnesota on offense or defense, it seemed like the person ready to capitalize in the correct spot was Niara Sabally. Something I like to talk to young college athletes about is what I call the boardroom. You know, everybody wants to have the green light to be able to do whatever they want offensively or defensively. But I want young athletes to kind of look at this like a business. If you are an entry-level employee or an hourly employee, you couldn't just walk into the executive suite and say to them, here's how I think things should be going. You'd have to prove to them that you can do all of the work assigned to you proficiently, and then, and only then, would they be open to your opinion and move you up that, work chain and give you more responsibility and give you more control and give you more influence. And I think people forget that that's how it works with sports. Everyone wants to have an expanded role. We all do. We're competitors. But the expanded roles go to those who crush their own roles first. Niara Sabally just earned a lot more for herself. And I love the fact that she's coached by someone who said, well, she's playing well, so we're just going to let it ride. I know so many coaches who would have put their starters back in or put their more reliable veterans back in. And in game 5, the deciding game of the WNBA finals, Sandy Brondello said, "Now we're going to roll with you." Awesome situation on both sides. And I applaud that thinking, and perhaps it's, coincidental. I applaud that thinking because the guest on today's podcast is another brilliant thinker. There's not much you need to know statistically about Coach Juli Fulks, the new head coach at Marshall University, aside from she's brilliant and she wins, and wins a lot. Now, to give a little more context to that, Juli Fulks is one of only 8 coaches to win 400 or more career games in less than 20 seasons of coaching. And she brings that expertise to Marshall on the heels of one of the best 3-year runs in the history of Division III basketball. She was previously the head coach at Transylvania, and we're going to talk about her experience at Transylvania a lot. But the big piece of that experience that you need to know is in her final 3 seasons at Transylvania, the Transylvania team went 91-2. That is correct. 2 losses in 3 years. One of those losses was in an Elite 8. One of those losses was in a Final 4. And the other season featured 0 losses, and they won a national championship, which, and I'm quickly checking my notes here, is the best you can do, it turns out. Who knew? This is someone who you're going to have an opportunity to learn modern championship standards from. But in addition to sharing her standards, there's much more to Juli Fulks that I think is interesting, and it is specifically the way she thinks. I first had a lengthy conversation with Coach Fulks when I was trying to round out research for my book about the recruiting process. And I was trying to talk to different people once I got some data back and get their opinions to help me make sense of the data. She was actually recommended to me by her assistant coach, who I knew a lot better at the time, Hannah Verrill. Hannah and I were in a mentoring group together through the Women's Basketball Coaches Association. Hannah is now the head coach at Transylvania. She's taking over for Coach Fulks now that Coach Fulks has departed to Marshall. And once I heard Juli Fulks talk once, it was one of those moments where, and I'm sure you've had these conversations with someone in your life. Juli Fulks is that someone to me that when I heard the way she thinks about leadership, about managing change, and about the game of basketball itself, I was not only inspired, but completely fascinated by how she thinks about things. We're going to talk a little bit about that during this interview. She considers herself a systems thinker, and she has a very scientific approach, not only to the X's and O's of basketball, but also to the way that she approaches conversations and change in her management style. She is very focused on maximizing, very focused on teaching in an efficient way, and perhaps more than anyone I've met in this profession, extremely based in truth. She wants to have a reason why her players do what they do, her coaches do what they do, and why she makes the decisions she makes. And to her, if you can't back the decision with data, then it's not a decision worth making. We are going to talk about a lot of those decisions that led her to be the coach she is now in the first half of this podcast. And then when we get to the second half, you just need to listen. Parents, players, coaches, you need to hear her messaging about how you should navigate the recruiting process, what is most important to her as a college coach about your ability and your attitude, and then at the end, what she would do now as a recruit if she were in your shoes. I have been privileged to have great guests on this show, and there will be more great guests to come. But this, in terms of Jared Zeidman's personal interesting-o-meter, if you will, is a 10 out of 10 on that scale. My interview with Coach Juli Fulks starts right now. Something unique about basketball, Coach, is that it can really take you to a lot of different places. And if I had a pin that followed you around the country for your basketball journey, you are very well traveled. So my first question to you, Juli Fulks, how's West Virginia?
West Virginia has been awesome. I love that you said well-traveled. We grew up, my dad was a truck driver growing up. And so I still remember, back when I don't think were seatbelt laws, they would take us on family vacation and they would give us the giant Rand McNally maps. There are so many listeners who won't even know what I'm talking about. Our only entertainment then was I would follow along in the maps as we went state by state to different places. And I think my parents' love of going and seeing new places honestly transferred to all of their kids. And so it has just allowed me to always think about going different places and being willing to try new experiences. And so West Virginia is not very far from the original home of Northwest Ohio. And so it has been great to be here. We're having a blast. I love outdoor things. We went whitewater rafting 2 weeks ago. So it has been great.
Oh, that's fantastic. And, I know there's a lot of new things. So in one way, environmentally, it kind of feels like home. In one way, we're on the verge of all things new because this is your first foray into D1. And I actually want to start with that. Something that I'm very, very privileged to kind of know as a coach is I know a lot of outstanding Division III coaches who, frankly, have been slept on by greater people. You had an amazing, amazing run at multiple stops at the Division III level, which we'll talk about more in a second. But I would just love to know from your perspective, what makes now the right time and Marshall the right place to, try to bring the Juli Fulks coaching philosophy to the Division I level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I laugh because everywhere I've been has been kind of 10 years, so on the decade program. And I think part of that is what made it the right time in the sense that, I really enjoy building. And so I've never been a job jumper when people have reached out. I really like the process of bringing young women in, helping them, meet their goals on the court, off the court, and to really see that through. And so for me, apparently it seems like it takes about 10 years for me to feel like I've done what I can do and need a different setting. But both jobs had probably the same, setting as to what made me choose there. And both of those was the amazing leadership. When I visited Transylvania, it was very clear I was going to work for an outstanding athletic director who took our program to the, not just women's basketball, but took athletics to the top of the country. And that was similar when Marshall reached out. There's a new president, Brad Smith. He came in a couple years ago. He's from Marshall. He ran into it as a CEO and then came back to Marshall. And he hired the athletic director, Christian Spears. And when I came on the interview, it was just really clear that Marshall as a university has been doing really great things for the last couple of years and, has a great history, but, kind of on that next jump to amazing levels. And when I had a chance to sit down with both of them and talk about their vision and what they saw in Marshall as a university, not just athletics and not just women's basketball, for me, it was that whole piece. I really love universities and presidents and athletic directors have big vision that you can go do the things you want to do and aren't always caught up in red tape.
Only people that have worked inside higher ed really understand that last part.
Yeah.
But it's funny that you talk about vision. Every time I chat with you, I am really fascinated by the way that you think. I know I've heard you tell other people that you're a systems thinker, but I also think that the way that you think about work, basketball leadership also allows you to be a forward thinker. And there's a question I want to ask you mostly because I think it's important for young people to understand it. Like, I think if someone asked you, is Juli Fulks from her first year at Lewis and Clark coaching basketball the same way as Juli Fulks in her first year at Marshall, you'd yell no.
Yeah, that is true. That is true.
But I would love to know the specific ways that, you think you've changed the most because of the way you think. You know, what are the key differences in those 2 10-year jumps that you've taken from start to finish?
Yeah, no, that's a great, maybe I should say I'm probably a scientist at my core. That biology level biology major in college has never changed in the fact that, I really think I naturally look at most things as a science experiment.
Sure.
And looking at anything we do, whether it's offense, defense, leadership, development, you do different things. And for me, I like to look at the result, analyze the result, and then figure out, does it fit the mission of whatever we're trying to accomplish? And obviously there's been a ton of mistakes along the way and all of those pieces too. And so, I think a lot of it is we all do this work on terms of figuring out what our values and missions as coaches. And, now I know 21 years later, it's not just the basketball. It's probably the basketball is the lesser of the amount of, I really want to help the women, the assistant coaches figure out what are their goals? What are their goals on the court? What are their goals off the court? What are the things they're passionate about? And I really think our job as head coaches is to help them meet all those goals. And when you're able to do that and grow everybody, it's inevitable that things are always kind of moving forward in the right direction. And so, I would say I've probably changed everything. And maybe it's because I'm just a lot more clear now on what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, but with a lot of flexibility within that.
This is a really interesting response to me, because I talk to a lot of young coaches, and a question, frankly, that I wasn't prepared to answer when I was a younger coach in my mid-20s was, so why are we doing that?
You're right.
So,
why.
if I were to, would you say that your why is more concrete now?
Yeah,
you're flexible more on how to get there, though.
Yeah, it's more concrete. It's more evolved, and I think when as you're growing in any business, you're figuring out what actually does drive you. And I probably I grew up an athlete playing multiple sports, and I think at the beginning, I felt like it was the sports that were driving me. And then what I've realized over time is that's not my main factor. That I get enjoyment out of. It's watching anybody go through something in life and then finding a way through it and then finding success from that. And I think that's the part I really love. And, I think whatever we all have as journeys, when we're able to help somebody else meet their goals, there's a lot of fulfillment in that for me.
So I want to talk about some of your more recent journey fulfillments. The run over the last 3 years at Transylvania, as someone that is, a big supporter of both you and Hannah Varrell, was just so fun to watch. I believe the 3-year record was 91-2.
That sounds right.
even the biggest cynic would look at that record and say, it's a pretty decent performance.
Yeah.
So, win a national championship, multiple Elite Eights, make it back to a second Final Four. But what's interesting to me is, trajectory-wise, it seemed like you were on your way there before the pandemic shutdown. But the pandemic shutdown is also this really interesting time in Transylvania's sort of journey, because you're sort of right there, and then all of a sudden you sort of reemerge in 2021 and you're a juggernaut. I don't want to, assume, but I'm curious if there was any specific transformation by whether X's and O's or leadership or team-wise that happened that really, accelerated that out of the shutdown.
Yeah. I think lots of things happened during the shutdown that I think were really interesting phenomenon for all of us, but, on the court. And one of our core, mantras for me personally, that is, going to all of our teams, is show up, work hard, and adapt. And we've always foundationally really believed in adapting. And so whether we're adapting game plans to find a way to win, or adapting behavior to be a better teammate, leader, whatever it is that we're adapting and changing, we're willing to do that and open to do that. And I think, part of the piece of the pandemic, that because we had adaptation as one of our core values, that next year when we never knew who we were going to play, if we were going to play, we were able to kind of ride that out, I thought, at a pretty high level. And, the other piece of that was because we never knew who we were going to play and we had a physically big roster, we had decided, hey, we're going to go all in on zone. We've always done some sort of make mix, recipe. And I'm like, let's try this. I've never coached zone for an entire year. And so we did that. And it was really interesting. And, we found ways to get through it and overcome problems and hurdles and problems and hurdles. And then the next year, when we kind of started on this 91-2 run, we went back to what we were doing originally. And full disclosure, our last scrimmage before the first game did not go well. and we had lots of things going on off the court. And I said, hey, let's just try to play zone. Let's just play zone. And they happened to be great at it. And I thought, and then who knew that, we're going to win the next 3 championships playing all zone. But the part of it I loved is it really made us as a coaching staff always step back and say, why is this working?
Right.
Like, this is not the normal. This is not what people think should happen. And why are we able to do it? And what are the pieces underlying the success that everybody is overlooking? And now if we were ever talking zone defense, I can easily list the reasons of why it works and why I think it's, kind of probably undervalued in a lot of defensive schemes. But the biggest one I would actually align with is it is the far easier to teach if it's all you're doing. And so for freshmen, I can help a freshman be really great at their position in much less time than man-to-man, because we know as coaches, I can set you up 1,000 different ways on man-to-man on defense to fail.
Right.
And so I thought that was one of the most interesting things for us was it was more efficient in teaching.
There is a lot of pragmatic components to what you just shared, and it kind of full circle goes back to your biology thing. This is, to me, scientific method. Like, here's the problem.
Yes.
Here's what I hypothesize, and then we literally just evaluate it and draw conclusions. And something I know about you that I also want parents and athletes to hear, because I think it adds a lot of objectivity to coaching. And I've heard a lot of young people and parents say, oh, this coach plays favorites, this coach does this coach does that. You rely a lot on advanced analytics. And I think that something that I really like about your coaching style is that a lot of your decisions are data-driven. I would love to know if there was something that caused you to lean further into that, and how those types of, data-driven decisions have potentially helped conversations with your athletes.
Yeah. Well, for sure, when I happened to be able to work with Tim Weitzel, who's still coaching, with me 21 years later, he has an advanced degree in statistics and his life is around statistics. And so I naturally gravitated to the math. And then he honestly taught me a whole new level of ways to look at numbers. And since then, he has his own private company and he runs analytics for several Division I women's basketball teams. So we had to figure out how we were going to work that out now. But, I think that was the one part that he and I really aligned with. While I couldn't do the math, we really liked looking at things from different perspectives and just always talking things out. Hey, what about this? This is what it seems like the math should say. Does it say? And, trying to figure out when you have these little data points that don't line up, why is that? And how do we take advantage of things? And so I think, naturally, I just really appreciate looking at things pragmatically. And I think there's some real value in those pieces, but he for sure is the impetus for many of our successful formulas and data-driven. And it's a huge part in all of our game plans. And it's different than, that should be the real plug. Everybody should call him and hire him, because it's different than what we get from anybody in terms of game planning.
So building on that, because there were a few, definitely not to the level of what you're talking about. And I think you and I are on the same page in terms of my understanding of math. So, but building on that, I found that when I had data to point to, it made accountability related conversations easier. Not saying it made them fun. I remember when I was 18 and I didn't like being told I was bad at anything. But I think being able to show somebody, hey, we're making decisions based on plus minus and this is yours. Or we're making decisions based on, rebounding efficiency and this is yours. Or we've calculated how the last, 16 possessions have ended in your hands and this is that. Has it helped make conversations with your players more black and white in terms of expectations?
Yeah, I think so for sure. And, while math doesn't always give us the whole picture, there's always things that it alludes to and displays. And I think they can at least appreciate that they understand. We try to be very transparent on why our decisions happen.
Sure.
Whether it's playing time or what we're doing on offense, what we're doing on defense, this is the reasoning and here's the math behind it. I actually think one of the areas that it helps the most, and maybe people don't think this way necessarily, is shot selection, right? Like we all know everybody's kind of going towards threes and layups and that sort of thing. And I think one of the ways to look at shot selection is also time to teach. In my opinion, being an effective 3-point shooter for most athletes is the fastest thing that they can get effective and great at. It's the same shot. It's predictable. You can give me average effort in our program, and I can get you above 35% by the time you leave. If we need to be great at attacking the rim and finishing, takes more time. If we need to be great at interior play, takes the most time. Well, besides, and then, like you talk about mid-range, and to me, the hard thing about mid-range is you got to be good from 5 feet, 6 feet, 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet. And so when people talk about mid-range, they act like it's one shot, but it's really 15 with defenders. And so, some of the value, I think, in becoming great at understanding shot selection is understanding, if you're going to give me this set amount of time, let's be realistic about what you can get great at, and not pretend that if you're giving us average effort, you're going to be great at being a finisher or somebody shooting, mid-range shots. It just doesn't work that way. And so I think it's always helped us in terms of talking about shot selection, and that shot selection is correlated to time in the gym. And so the more shots you want to be able to take, the more time you've got to give us.
This is, wow, you have no idea that you just did this, but you just alley-ooped me a segue. So thank you.
I love that. I love that. A good assist.
Yeah, so much of your talking points here are about maximizing. We're going to maximize what you put in. And so much of my current talk with recruits is how to maximize their standing with coaches.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of deviate into the recruiting process part, without attributing specific data or points to you, I do want to say to our listeners, who know about my research with recruiting and my, relationships as a coach, you were one of the people I really talked to make sense of some of the data I had. And one of the things that you talked about that I know you'll be comfortable sharing was your stance on AAU and quote unquote elite high school basketball. And, something I was a little bit surprised by when I got data back from the coaches was that whether it was D1 or D3, nobody seemed to really care if the kid was on the best AAU team or the most elite prep team. But if you flip that, the kids kind of play that misinformation maximizing game, and they think that if they're not on the best AAU team or they're not on the best high school team, that they're minimizing their chances of being seen. I would really love, for the sake of educating young people, to hear your take on this. Why is it not as important to you? Or maybe better said, why is the elite AAU team or the prestigious high school team not going to be what tips the scales for Juli Fulks about a recruit?
Yeah, well, I think, maybe this is my own bias to my background. I came from a small area in Northwest Ohio with parents that had modest incomes. And so those weren't opportunities for me. And a lot of times when I look at situations for players, whether you're on the best team or, just the team in your local area, they both have pros and cons, depending on how many minutes you play. And I think if you really were getting to choose what team you'd want to go on, I would say I would want you to be on the team that actually develops and teaches IQ at a really high level. I think that would help players more than anything. But, I think as coaches, when you're recruiting so many games in the summer, we know not everybody's going to be on the best teams. And, while that can be good because you're going against higher levels of competition, every positive is negative, every negative is a positive. You can find the flip side of that is you're now playing less minutes and less is expected. And so maybe on your high school team, you're the starting point guard and they have your success directly correlates to your team's success. And that has a level of pressure that matters. And so if you don't play well, there is a good chance that your team does not win. Versus the counter side of it is now you're on, the elite AAU team and you're not asked to utilize two of your skill sets because somebody else does that and you play different roles. And so there can be real value in both of those. And so I don't think for me, when we're looking at players, we're trying to find elite talent and athleticism. I mean, there's just a baseline for all of us on kind of the level of speed and strength and abilities that everybody has to have as the minimum. And then just kind of wherever your path took you, I think most coaches are willing to work with you. And probably because we've always done that. We've had players that go through, whichever circuit, that's great. We've had players come from, other sides. And if you're able to be taught, you like learning and you go hard, I think you have the same upside. And so, I think there's just value in both.
Yeah. And you don't know this, but the funny thing about the way you just responded is the guest that is appearing the week before you was a scholarship basketball player who did not play AAU. So
yeah.
By the way, that doesn't mean it's not a good option, but
Yeah.
to your point about it's different for everybody and we really don't go through the same experience with every kid, I think is really important. But
well, I got even one better. The national championship team, our 4 starters who were in the same class, 2 played AAU for elite teams and 2 did not play AAU. And, these are multiple year starters and people playing in Elite 8, Final Four, and national championships who, because of doing different things, multiple sports, whatever, did not play AAU. And they had pretty good careers.
And now you, just hearkening back to something you shared previously, you were a multi-sport athlete. Because I also know from talking to former athletes myself, a lot of them feel like they got their most insightful coaching experiences not from basketball, because in basketball they were the top dog. So it took like a coach from a different sport to teach them resilience, to teach them discipline. Did you have a similar experience that you can relate to?
Well, I think the experience I can relate to is the best coaches that I played for were my volleyball coaches in high school, and they strung championship after championship after championship and went, I don't remember the numbers now, 10 or 12 years in a row winning the conference championship.
Oh, wow.
And when I started getting into coaching, and now I can look back and I know exactly, the things they did and the reasons we were great, which kind of all the normal things. They were great at building team culture. We were great at the fundamentals. The game was, in some ways, they kept it very simple, and we were just better at all the things that happen all the time. But, still different things, like every day they had set, different passing partners so that there were no, quote, cliques within the group, just all the different small things that they did. And so for me, that was one of the pieces. I think being a multi-sport athlete exposes you to a lot more coaches and a lot more coaching styles. And so, if you're going into coaching, that's a real win, because you just have that many more people that you see and understand how they do it different. And, I'm not shy about saying I wish players were still multi-sport athletes. I think there's a lot of value. It's great for the body. Sports IQ kind of translates when you're learning different things. I think soccer players are great defenders because there's a lot of spatial similarities. And, so I'm one of the people that still wishes more people were allowed to, do multiple sports. I think it's really good for young students, and you don't always know at 13, 14 what you're going to love at 16 and 17.
I do think that there is going to be a pendulum swing with that, especially as more and more data comes out about injury and overuse too. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So now let's flip this, because we're talking about how, there's different ways to find a kid. There's no one right way to kind of get yourself recruited, but there also has to be things that you see an athlete do on the court, where you see them and you're like, that kid.
Yes.
So what does make a kid a home run to you?
Well, I think for us, if it's a home run, it's going to be somebody that has a ton of speed, strength, and ability to just move like a high-level athlete. Rebounding is it's tied to athleticism and work ethic, but it's really hard to be a great rebounder if you're just not a great athlete. They don't really go hand in hand. And so I think there's, for me, a baseline athleticism that we have to have, and then an ability to see how they could become a multidimensional scorer. So maybe, you're coming in as a freshman and you're a great shooter that already has range, and, you're not particularly good at going both directions and finishing at the rim, or conversely, you're great at getting to the rim and we need to spend time extending range, or, whatever it is. I like to look at them and say, okay, can we see a bigger future than just what they're doing right now? If given the coaching, skill time, and development, and creating an environment where they can learn and get better. I think that's probably one of the pieces that has become really important to me through my PhD research, is to really think about, I get real nerdy with this, and you could go the idea of potential energy is the energy you store relative to your environment. And so if you go conversely as basketball coaches, our job is to create an environment to tap into every ounce of potential. And so if we're not getting the most out of them, what do we need to do? What do we need to change so that we can help them absolutely tap into every ounce that they have.
I'd like to ask you a follow-up because I really like the way that you framed that. I imagine, just because I've recruited myself, that, part of your recruiting pitch to someone is, here's the environment that we are going to aspire to create for you daily so that you can maximize that ability. If you then had the opportunity to kind of say the other part, here's what we'll be expecting from you. Here's what we're expecting you to put in, because I'd love for a high school athlete to kind of hear that. Yeah. What would your expectations be?
Well, I think if I was lining out the most important is that you are truly teachable and coachable. And, and I think that's much harder than it always sounds. And when we talk to freshmen about helping them learn to respond, because the most likely thing when they come in as a freshman during teaching is they're going to be wrong. And, you keep adding a lot of information and, it's hard to remember it all and assemble it all and do it in a timely manner. And so there's just a lot of correction, and that's expected, normal, and great. And the piece that you're trying to hope with our freshmen, like we have a young lady on our roster right now, a freshman who is incredibly coachable, and she gets lots of feedback daily and takes it and smiles and fixes it and keeps trying and keeps trying and keeps trying. Like, she is what you hope all freshmen would be like, or transfers, whoever's coming into your program. For me, if you are that type of player, your ability is so much faster than if we have to work through every time I give you feedback, you have a response, and then we change. Right. If we can eliminate the negative response of whatever it is, whether it's I just beat myself up and, have negative self-talk that's not related to the coaches, or maybe it's pushback to the coaches, or, any of the negatives that we've seen, if we can just get to the point where here's feedback, no emotional response, change, it's a really quick rise in their development. And so that's what I would tell everybody, is it, really thinking about how do I handle feedback, especially if you're coming from a place where most times you're the one getting it right. And so the feedback is often going to your teammates because you're the best player on the team. And so you're not used to constant feedback. So that's a shift. And so I think that's a really big piece. And then, you have to compare yourself to your goals. And so I think the goal setting piece is really important, because when we think about what we value on the court, there's no other way to look at it than, does your time align with your values? And so if I want to be first team in the Sun Belt this year, that means I'm probably going to have to outwork 95% of the other 12 teams to have that happen. And even if I am genetically really gifted. And so am I willing to put in that kind of work to have that kind of reward? Because somebody is. And so, that is, obviously outside of practice, getting in the gym, shooting. And so for me, I think we always want players on our team that have really big goals. And a part of that is aligning with how we behave with those goals in terms of being a great teammate, in terms of our effort on the court, in terms of our work ethic. And if you can align both of those and be really honest, that helps you in the college process. It's much harder when you believe you have big goals. You aren't putting the time in to get those goals. And so obviously you're not getting those goals. And now you either have to lie to yourself and tell yourself you're a hard worker.
Right.
Or you have to acknowledge, hey, I actually am not putting in the time, energy, effort to meet my goals. And so I either need to change my goals or I need to change my behavior.
Particularly with what you just mentioned, there is a third party that can also greatly impact the development of these athletes that are going through that sort of mental thing. And that is parents and guardians and the families of these athletes, because an athlete can look at you, their head coach, and say, I'm working really hard, and you kind of have your experience to lean on and the tape to lean on and, what they're doing day to day to lean on. But they say to their parents, I'm working as hard as I can. And that's all I'm hearing. I don't see them practice every day.
Yeah.
I have always really, really enjoyed listening to your take on parents, especially through the recruiting process, because I think you are more open to having discussions with parents and certain types of parental involvement than other coaches. But especially given what you just said about having habits that match up with your goals and the things that you actually want to aspire to. Can you talk parents through how they could be the most effective advocates and representatives of their kids, both kind of through the recruiting process and beyond? Because I know you have experiences with this.
Yeah. I think parents, they're really valuable in the recruiting process. And many of my great relationships have been, with the parents. Shoot, I'm much closer in their age now than I am, the high school athletes and recruits. So I can relate better to the parents too now. And so I think, if I'm a parent coming to a visit, I would love if parents could really prep their daughters and what's important to you, because they know their daughters. And then how do you ask these questions? I think anytime that as on myself or parents, we can help teach them the life skills that they're going to need, because it's the same thing when, while now we're interviewing essentially colleges to figure out if I want to play basketball there. At some point, they're also interviewing and being interviewed for jobs. And, mom and dad are not there. And so how can we use this process to teach life skills, which is helping them learn how to speak for themselves? And, and then the parents and I can help guide them through that. But I think that's a great first step for parents is help them really articulate what matters. And hopefully parents really make sure they come up with truthful answers because they do know their players. And, maybe what matters most is I go to the highest level I can attain, playing time aside. Right. Maybe what matters most is I go, to the next level, but I can start. Whatever their real goals are, I think that's a really important piece in the process. And honestly, while this will never change for me, no matter the level, I really want parents to also value the academic side, because at the end of the day, even if they go here and then they play professionally, at some point we are probably going to enter the real world. And so I want them all to take advantage of the basketball court and the classroom. And so helping them find value in both sides, even if truly at 16, 17, maybe I don't value the classroom side yet. As adults, we do know it comes into play at some point. And so how can we maximize all of the benefits that they're going to get so that when they leave, they are connected, they have great degrees, they've had a great basketball experience. And then I would say when parents, once your daughters are in the college process, it's a great reminder for parents to know, and I think it's important that we talk to our players, there's always got to be the people that you vent to, right? And sometimes you vent for solutions, and sometimes you just vent because you need to be heard. And, parents need to realize sometimes they're just always going to be a primary venter. And so they, take things with a grain of salt, because they could call them, vent for 5 minutes, and then literally be fine. And mom and dad are sitting there and really, upset or having emotional responses, and their daughters have moved on. And so you never know which of those occurrences happen. But then the other piece is to remember you're not at practice. And so you can ask questions. You can encourage your daughters to go and talk to the coaches, and helping them, be really good at learning how to be an adult during the process. If they like things, if they're not sure of things, that's a really important skill set. And I think if everybody is on the same page, when I am working with parents about helping their daughters meet goals, it's much better than if there's, conflict between the two.
Love that. So I have been asking my final question to everyone that's appeared on the second half of this podcast, because ultimately this is an engine that is supposed to be an education base for young people trying to navigate the recruiting process. Knowing everything that you know now and your experience as both an athlete and a multi-decade coach, let's just hypothetically say you're 15, 16 years old again. It's the year 2024, so you have these instead of maps. You can use this if you'd like. But knowing everything you know now, how would you kickstart your recruiting process in the year 2024?
I think now, because you have all the information, you just have so many options. And, it was much harder to learn about colleges back in, 1996. And so some of it was just who was mailing you what, and that was kind of the end of it. Who saw you where. And, now I think because you have so many options, I think it becomes way more important to set your values early. How close do I want to be? So does it matter to me that when I play a game, mom and dad are in the stands, grandma, grandpa? Does it matter to me that when I play away games, it's still close enough for mom and dad to get to? Do I want to get away? Is my major going to be the driving force? I think you really now should figure out what it is that you value and why, And then you can just, type into the computer and it can help you a lot in terms of figuring out what might be a really good fit. And while I say all that, the counter is a lot of times you still don't even know what you don't know. And, be open to the idea of things you don't know. I mean, when Marshall reached out, through a connection, I didn't know all the amazing things that have been happening in the last 3 years. And that change was one of the reasons I was willing to consider the job and think about this job. And so I didn't know what I didn't know. And so if I didn't pick up the call and talk to the athletic director, I wouldn't have ended up here if I just made a blanket decision. And so, still do your research, but be open to the things that you don't know are out there that may be the best fit for you.
I love that. This has been great. And I just love, there's different people that I meet that I really just love hearing the way they think about things.
Well, you and I, we both know we could talk math and basketball for a very long time. And now baby. I can't wait to, for the post-interview baby session.
Yeah, the listeners, just so you're aware, the moment I stop this interview, I'm bringing the baby in to meet Juli Fulks. That'll be very exciting. But cannot wait to watch you in the squad. Best of luck with the rest of your opening practices and your scrimmages, and really excited to see what Juli Fulks has to do with the Thundering Herd. Thanks again, Coach.
Thanks, Jared. Always appreciate talking to you.
That's going to do it for another episode of the Nail the Recruiting Process podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope you got something out of today's podcast. If you'd like to learn more about anything related to Nail the Recruiting Process, the book, my work, maybe wanting to work with me one-on-one, anything under the sun, you're going to visit www.nailtherecruitingprocess.com. If you'd like to follow me on social media, you can follow me at Nail the Recruiting Process on Instagram, or at Jared the Coach on Twitter and TikTok. Both of those handles are just one word, no characters, no spaces. If you'd like to ask something of me directly, if you'd like a question that maybe you want answered on a future podcast, or if you have an idea for something we should talk about in a future episode, please reach out to me via email. I would love to hear from you. My email address is recruitinggear@gmail.com. That's the word recruiting, then the word gear combined. recruitinggear@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope to catch you next time.